Sometimes the Bible tells us stories that may not make sense at first glance. And one good example of a story like that is the account in Mark 11 and Matthew 21 of Jesus cursing the barren fig tree. We're told that he was going into Jerusalem with his disciples, was hungry, went off to see if a particular fig tree had any figs on it, finds that that tree does not, and basically blasts the tree, giving it a curse, which they find the next day has in fact destroyed this unfruitful fig tree. Well, it's an odd story. Skeptics often point to it to suggest that either Jesus didn't know what was going on, doesn't know all things, which would be a characteristic of God, that he somehow got confused about whether that fig tree had figs on it, or even worse, that Jesus lost his temper and simply destroyed the fig tree in a fit of irritation. Well, to understand what's really going on in this story, we have to look a little bit deeper. We have to consider the broader context of the narrative that this story is part of. And if we do that, what we'll find is not only does this story make very good sense, but in fact, it conveys to us and to the audience of Jesus' day a very important message. A message which is not spoken, but acted out, which you might call a parable of deeds rather than of words. Well, to understand what Jesus is trying to communicate here, we have to look, as I said, at the bigger picture. So what's happening surrounding this incident with the fig tree is that Jesus and his disciples have arrived at Jerusalem. They go into the city, and this is Jesus' famous triumphal entry where the Jewish people are praising him and singing hosannas and waving palm trees. Then he goes into the temple, and we're told he looks around, is what Mark 11 says. He looked around the temple. And then he comes out of the temple and proceeds back out of Jerusalem for the night. And the next morning, as he's going in a second time into Jerusalem, is when he sees this unfruitful fig tree. Now let's pause on this fig tree for a second. Because what we're told in Mark 11, is that this fig tree had leaves. Now, Mark also tells us that it wasn't the season for figs, which is why there were no figs. But the season for figs in this part of the world, in Palestine, is pretty large, actually. You can have figs born 10 of the 12 months. And depending on the elevation, depending on the climate, you realistically might have even had figs growing on a tree at that season around Passover as Jesus was going into Jerusalem. And more importantly, a typical fig tree will first have the figs appear. The first batch of figs will appear, and then the leaves develop. So if you see a fig tree with leaves, that indicates that it should have figs, because those figs would have begun developing before even the leaves sprouted. So leaves should mean figs on a healthy, fruitful fig tree. So that's why Jesus, at least at first glance on the surface, that's why Jesus would have headed in to look and see if that fig tree perhaps had early figs sooner than its fellows, or something along those lines. So anyway, he goes, he looks at that fig tree. That is when he sees that it's unfruitful and curses it. Then he heads on into the city, and now we're told that on his second return now to the temple, this second day, is when he famously cleanses the temple. He throws out the money changers, throws out those who've been polluting the temple, turning it into a place of business rather than a place of worship, cleanses the temple, condemns the religious leaders who allowed it to happen, and then heads back out of the city again, and that is when the disciples notice that the cursed, fruitless fig tree has actually, in fact, died. Well, what is Jesus trying to communicate with this enacted parable? It's actually fairly simple. Perhaps you already even see it as I've described the larger scene. What he's communicating is the fig tree represents the Jewish people, the religion at Jerusalem. Think about what Jerusalem has. As Jesus and his disciples go in, and again we're told he looks around the temple, what is he seeing? He's at Jerusalem, God's city. He's in God's temple that God gave instructions for how to build. He's looking at the sacrificial system that God enacted, carried out by God's priests that he appointed. And all of it is empty. It's a lot of show, it's a lot of ritual, and there's no heart and life to this empty religion. It's almost like a fig tree with leaves but no fruit. It looks like something should be there. You'd think something is there. But when you get close and look carefully, you're disappointed. And so Jesus, not confused at all, knowing what he wanted to communicate, on the way out from seeing the fruitlessness of Jewish religion, chooses to make an object lesson. Look, come and see, disciples. Here's this tree, which has the appearance of fruitfulness, but no fruit. And look at what the consequences are for not bearing fruit when you should, for not bearing the fruit that ought to be there. Jerusalem, the Jews, had received every blessing from God, and yet there was no fruit. And so they were on the verge of being cursed. They were on the verge of being destroyed, as in fact they were by the Romans a generation later, with the destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple. And Jesus is warning them, giving another of those last warnings which God always offers before destruction. Look what happens to the unfruitful fig tree. And Jesus goes back after cursing the fig tree, casts out, purifies the temple, casts out the money changers, those polluting it. This is what you have to worry about. This is what you have to fear. He's communicating to the Jews of his day. If you're not bearing the fruit that you should be bearing, judgment will come upon you. And he comes back out and his disciples see that cursed and now destroyed fig tree. And whether or not they understood at the time, it was a message that they would remember, they would record, they would communicate to those around them. A warning that if you don't bear fruit, there are consequences. If you have the appearance of true religion, but not its heart, that leads to death. It's a message that was important for the Jews. It's a message that's important for you and me as Christians who have also received blessing from God, who also have received a religion from God, and who also have a responsibility to bear fruit. And it's certainly not just an example of Jesus getting confused or Jesus losing his temper. Rather, it is something much more. It's an important, coherent, clear message, both for people of Jesus' day and for people of ours as well.